Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Today we're looking at the South Atlantic map once again for DCS World because it has recently undergone some transformational changes with regards to the texturing over the entire map, as well as some other key improvements such as better tree distribution, better detail, and various things of that nature. So today we'll be taking a close look at it again, and I will tell you if I think it's finally become something that you should probably spend your money and your time on. So without further ado, sit back and enjoy the video. First of all, let's start with the fact that I absolutely hated this map for many years since it came out, mostly as a result of what I think was very poor texturing. I do understand that they use satellite imagery and stitched it together, and I think in a lot of places it really felt very fake. Maybe the resolution or maybe the techniques that were used, just to me, unless you were flying at high altitude, and I think almost all maps in DCS look good at high altitude, it just didn't help the immersion aspect of flying through what is supposed to be absolutely jaw-droppingly gorgeous scenery around South America and the Falklands. The Falklands could be argued that it's very barren and therefore there's not much vegetation and not many objects, and therefore even in real life it just looks barren and not that interesting. I think I disagreed with that in the past with anybody that has argued that point, because I said that if you take Flight Simulator 2024 and you fly around even a desert looks beautiful to some degree and realistic as a result of using appropriate texturing or techniques that are, I don't know what, but I can tell you that just because an area is barren doesn't mean that it needs to be boring, and just because it doesn't have trees doesn't mean it's boring. And the Falkland Islands were actually improved on this map even a few updates ago, and I already did a video about that, and I said that it was a massive improvement. I still stick by that. I think they've really brought the Falklands to a point of where it is actually almost, I would say, enjoyable flying low level, even though it's relatively barren and there's not really much happening in terms of the ground detail. And yes, it could be better, yes, it could be higher resolution textures, but at the end of the day, I think you have to give them credit for the fact that at least in terms of the realms of DCS World, they have managed to create a rather convincing and appealing landscape to fly, even though it doesn't particularly look amazing in some places. In a lot of places it really does, and I think we still need to give them a lot of credit. When it comes to the mainland, or in other words, South America, I think this map was always fairly poor in terms of texturing and in terms of its tree distribution. And I think they've really improved it massively with this last update. I think they're starting to use the technology which is fairly similar to what Eagle Dynamics is using in their Iraq and Afghanistan maps, which creates this sort of feel to the mountains where it creates more of a three-dimensional feel to all the little textures, perturbations, all the little details and crevices in the mountains. I think they've started using that technology here, and I think it's massively improved it. At high altitude, it still looks amazing as it did before, but now at medium altitude, it looks amazing. And at low altitude, it starts to look a lot better, but in my opinion, still falling far short of what at least the experience that I would like to see. And I think part of that is not actually even due to the new textures. I think the new textures, at least within the realms of what DCS is currently capable of looking at other maps, are actually pretty good overall. But I think the way the vegetation, the choice of trees, the shape of the trees, the color palette of the trees, and also the tree distribution itself, you'll notice, in my opinion, still doesn't really look very realistic in a lot of places. And I think it's down to the fact that, one, the density of the trees isn't very high. Now, I know there's probably going to be some argument to say, well, we are limited by the DCS engine, how many trees you can pack into an area, and of course, it's a big performance hog. But my argument would be, well, the Caucasus map, which is a very old map, has some fairly densely, in fact, very densely packed trees and forests, and clearly it's capable of running fairly well in our simulators with densely packed trees in the Caucasus map. So my question is, why can't we have much more densely packed trees on the South Atlantic map as well? And as you can see, it's a little bit of an immersion breaker, because in a lot of these areas, which you know and you can tell by the underlying ground textures, are obviously supposed to be very densely packed forests, and when you're flying around them, you see such big gaps between trees that it completely kills the immersion, and also often the actual tree textures don't really make any sense with the underlying textures of the map that were used from, whether it's satellite imagery or hand painted, I don't really know, but at the end of the day, there's just a bit of a mismatch in a lot of places, and I think the way the trees are distributed is definitely an improvement compared to the previous iterations of this map, where it looked extremely artificial with straight lines, and I honestly, I couldn't even bear flying around anywhere at low level on this map before, but now I think there is a big improvement. However, I do still think that it's not entirely realistic, and you can see that in a lot of places flying at high altitude looking down, where the trees are sort of go between, whether it's snow sometimes or just the way the forest outlines are, still feels a little bit artificial. And it's definitely an improvement compared to what it was before, and I really do want to stress that this is a big improvement compared to the way this map looked previously. So I do want to say that it is definitely now at a point where I think it's very usable, but I think the use cases for it, at least for me personally, are very specific. I can't still imagine myself flying here at low level and enjoying the beautiful terrain, which is what I really hope this map would be about. I hope that this is finally a map that we can take fighter jets flying at 420 knots, low level at 250 feet, and we would just be immersed by the beautiful scenery around us, whether it's the lakes, the mountains, the shorelines. But in actual fact, that's still mostly impossible. In a lot of places, I think the map doesn't really look that great. And it is a big map. We have to remember that the area that this map covers is pretty enormous, and therefore it's probably unrealistic to expect a very high level of detail and texturing everywhere you go. But to be fair, even in some of the more populated areas where you'd expect players to fly a lot, I think it still falls very short in terms of the details that I think would be great for low-level flying, and therefore I still don't think I'd be using this map for low-level flying. When it comes to night lighting, this map looks great. But then again, I think a lot of maps in DCS look pretty great at nighttime, so if your plan is to fly mostly in the dusk or at night hours, I think this map will do very well, and I think there's nothing to complain about. When it comes to villages, towns, buildings, and streets, I think it's very decent. It's good. It's definitely not on par with the latest and greatest Eagle Dynamics technologies and their maps, but I think it's more than acceptable, and I don't think there's anything really to complain about. I think my biggest complaints about this map are definitely when it comes to the nature and the countryside, not the towns and cities. However, one thing I definitely have to point out is that this map offers something that other maps in DCS definitely do not, and that is a very big variety of rather small but very interesting airfields, which could be used for various different oddball types of flying, whether it's helicopters chasing down rally cars that I've done in my previous video, or whether you just want to fly a little circuit in some smaller aircraft. And I think some of these smaller airfields are actually modeled fairly nicely, and they are in some fairly nice locations scattered around the map, whereby I think they're very usable for something a little bit different, for something unique, and something maybe that we don't have on any of the other maps in DCS world, as we mostly have either big air bases or big international airports, whereas this map really does offer some relatively well detailed smaller airfields that could be very fun to fly around in some oddball things. And I think that is pretty much the use case for this map, at least for me, is flying helicopters, flying light aircraft, maybe doing some circuits, maybe doing some engine out circuits and practice forced landings, and just things of that nature. And when you're flying helicopters at low level in this map, it's actually pretty good. If you're flying a grass top or tree top or maybe bush top level, this map actually does look very nice, but once you just go a little bit higher up, from maybe 100 feet to about 500 feet, I think the immersion really does break down a little bit. So I think for me, the flying is either around some of the smaller airfields or potentially very low to the ground in a helicopter. That's where this map sort of shines for me. Another thing that I was perhaps slightly disappointed in is the fact that still, just like the Cola map, we still have buildings, especially around built-up areas and especially around airfields, which seem like they are sitting in the middle of the grass where they don't really belong. And it's a little bit immersion breaking, because I don't think other new maps really have this issue. If you look at maps made by Ugra Media or Eagle Dynamics themselves, you never really seem to find this issue around air bases, but here and the Kola map, we still have buildings which are plumped in the middle of nowhere, which doesn't really make any sense. Now, it is not a huge deal per se, and I will give them credit for the fact that I think they have nailed the ground textures of all the airfields, all the air bases. I think they really look very good, highly detailed, very high resolution textures, and in that sense they have created some very realistic airbase and airfield environments. So I think we could probably forgive them for the odd building which is misplaced and just sitting in the middle of nowhere. One slightly disappointing thing is that this map actually offers some grass strips, which again is very rare in the realms of DCS maps, and again would be such a cool thing to have for flying warbirds, maybe some props. But unfortunately, the grass strips have very dense and tall grass growing all over them, which I don't know if that was something that the developer could have somehow erased in that particular area, or perhaps had just replaced the grass with some short grass. I don't really know if this is just a very big limitation of DCS World, but it sort of renders the grass strips unusable or extremely unrealistic, because if you put a Spitfire in there and you have the grass reaching the propeller, well, I just don't think it makes a lot of sense. So I think that is a huge disappointment as well, having a grass strip that's not really usable. But when it comes to all these other little strips and airfields which are not grass but maybe concrete or some form of gravel, I do think they look very cool indeed. And of course, the main disappointment, I think, is that this map was modeled on the current day Falkland Islands, not the Falklands conflict, which in my opinion would have made a lot more sense. Of course, we don't have any full fidelity aircraft or any assets from that time era, from the 80s, that we could simulate with a Sea Harrier and the Argentinian Mirages or whatever. And I don't think you can really do that, because we have Mount Pleasant, which is a modern day RAF base on the Falklands. And I think it was a very strange decision by the developer to create this map based on a modern day. Sort of doesn't really make any sense to me. However, like I say, it does offer something relatively unique that other maps don't. And I think if you're interested in flying around the Falkland Islands, it's pretty cool. If you're interested in flying some of these smaller airfields, doing some oddball things, just maybe some GA flying, maybe you just want to take an L-39 out for some aerobatics overhead the airfield, I think this is a really cool map, and I don't think there's anything else in DCS World that even comes close in that respect. So in conclusion, I think this map is a huge improvement over what it was. I think it still definitely falls short of what I was hoping it would be, which is a beautiful map to fly at low level. I think it really still does fail at that. However, if you want to fly at medium to high altitudes, it is absolutely beautiful in that sense. So I think it depends on your use case. If your use case involves very low fighter jet flying, I'd say it's not really there. Also, if your use case is historical accuracy or plausible conflicts, probably avoid as well. And yet, having said all of that, probably the greatest shortcoming of this map is the lack of gameplay. Now, this could be said of a lot, if not all, DCS maps, but I think it is especially true for something so niche such as the South Atlantic map. Unlike other maps which are inevitably going to be much more popular in multiplayer, the South Atlantic map definitely isn't, and it's a very unique, very niche, very specific use case map, which could be very fun to fly on had the developer provided us with lots of different interesting missions, for example, bombing ranges for different types of aircraft that we could go and do. But unfortunately, map developers, for some reason in DCS World, just don't realize the value that they could be adding to their products, the maps that they're developing, had they just created interesting missions and gameplay. And this could also involve very unique specific ground units, whether it's AI or simply static units for different air bases and airfields, that could just add a huge level of immersion. But unfortunately, for some reason, map developers just don't seem to understand that. And I think this is where the South Atlantic map, considering the fact that it is such a unique and such a niche map that doesn't offer any plausible conflicts, it could really do with some really interesting gameplay. And I just don't think it's there for either single player or multiplayer unless you're prepared to create it yourself in the mission editor. Well, that's it, folks. I hope you've enjoyed this little overview. If you disagree with me, please feel free to comment down below and tell me if you think I'm wrong. Or if you think there's another use case for this map that perhaps I haven't covered, or any other details regarding this map that perhaps I should have covered, do comment down below. It would be very interesting to read your comments, but also it'll be great to help out the YouTube algorithm. So hopefully you've enjoyed this video. Please smash the like button if you have, and hopefully I shall catch you in the next video. Adios.